Our speaker for today is Shay Stewart Boulay, and her subject is Black Girl in Maine, musings of a black woman living in one of the nation's whitest states. Shay is an award-winning writer and sorry about that. Shay is an award-winning writer and blogger. I think she comes from Chicago. She's a graduate of both DePaul University and Antioch University, New England. She is the executive director of Community Change Incorporated, a 45-year-old civil rights organization in Boston that has been educating and organizing for racial equality since 1968. The program will take the format of Shay doing her presentation, then we'll have a question and answer period. And in the meantime, if you'd like some tea and refreshments, please feel free to help yourself. And with that, Shay, we will turn the stage over to you.
Great. Well, thank you all. Thank you for coming out on this almost spring-like day. It may not look like spring to you, but as a year-round allergy sufferer, I can assure you that it is very spring-like today because I'm having a sinus and allergy thing going on, so I'm a little hazy today. I had to take some allergy meds. Also, just an interesting note, I think it was 14 years ago when I was still in Chicago and researching my move to Maine, which at that point included considering moving to New Hampshire. I actually had reached out to the trail, doing Google search and trying to figure out where are black people in this part of the country. So it feels really sort of like a full circle experience being invited to speak here. Just because in my 13 years here in New England, I've started doing so much work around race and just talking, so it really kind of feels sort of like, wow, full circle. Anyway, I'm just gonna talk. To me, I like dialogues, I like conversations, and I'm not an academic, even though some of my work crosses into that area. So it's just a regular conversation, and I brought some notes with me, and I admit I will probably use them. I guess because the topic of this discussion really rotates around my blog, which is called Black Girl in Maine, I'll start off talking a little bit about how I came to Maine, some of my initial impressions of Maine, and which eventually led to the formation of the blog. I moved to Maine in March of 2002. Which was a really interesting time because we were just coming off of 9/11, and as a nation, we were all, we're just feeling so much stuff. And it was a really odd time to, as a person of color, to pack yourself up to move to a predominantly white place. I moved to Maine because I have a 23-year-old son, but at that time he was not 23. And after a kind of a contentious custody battle, we just needed to be in the same place. And so Maine it was. So for me, coming to Maine was not, for many people, they moved to New England and it's something that they want to do. It wasn't something that I wanted to do. I'm actually from Chicago. I'm a city girl through and through. I like concrete, I like buildings. I still marvel at the fact that I live on a block that where I'm from in Chicago, we could stick 500 people, except on my block, there are only 3 on that side of the street. Seems like we're not, efficiently utilizing our space. So when I first came to Maine, I had come up to this part of the country and I thought it was really beautiful to visit. But I'm going to be honest and say that moving to Maine was probably up there. It's probably been up there with like top 5 life-altering experiences for me. I'm a Gen Xer, meaning I was born in the early 1970s, raised in Chicago. My dad was raised in Arkansas and is a product of Jim Crow, which deeply influenced many things for him. As soon as he graduated from high school, the way he always told us the story, he graduated that afternoon, he was on a Greyhound bus out of Blytheville, Arkansas that night, and he never wanted to come back. And he made a real good job of making sure he never came back because I can count on my hand maybe 4 or 5 times that I've ever been to Blytheville, Arkansas in my life. So, my dad really wanted us to have a different way of life, and definitely by being in Chicago, that happened. I went to predominantly white schools. However, I spent a lot of time in black spaces. My grandparents lived on the south side of Chicago, so even though I would go into spaces that during the day were predominantly white, evenings and weekends, it was a safe space. And in my mind, I just assumed that we all had safe spaces and places that we could go where people looked like us. So for me, moving to Maine became one of those sort of like, okay, it's a little different. First off, it's very rural. There were some simple adjustments I had to make, like the fact that in places like New Hampshire and Maine, if you wake up at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and you want to eat breakfast, you're not going to eat breakfast. That's not going to happen. We spent the first year going to places going, what do you mean you don't serve breakfast? Or finding out that, like in our town, things are closed on Sundays. I'm like, what happens on Sundays that's so miraculous that nothing can be open? I know it's the Sabbath, but we can't eat. I've learned to cook real well, I'll tell you that, living in this part of the country. But the race thing immediately became a real issue. I noticed that when you come to Maine as a person of color to visit, people are warm, they're welcoming, but it's very different when they realize that the season has ended and you still happen to be there. Sort of like, wait, you moved here. There were a lot of things that at that time I didn't understand about Maine in terms of, because of my own experiences in Chicago and places that I had been, it never dawned on me that there was a portion of the country that was so white and so insular that people literally would not know how to really react and relate to people who were different. Case in point, first job I got in Maine, my background prior to kind of moving into the work that I do now was in social work and nonprofit management. So working with subsidized housing, and I'll never forget, a woman called the office and couldn't remember my name. This was in late 2002, and I tell this story because it's one of those you never forget it moments. Woman couldn't remember my name, and she asked for the colored girl. When I heard that, I was stunned. Like, who uses the word colored in 2002? And of course I'm still in my Chicago mode, so I'm like, ah! I've now come to learn over my 13 years that there are just people I'm not going to reach, they're just conversations I'm not going to have. But that was the beginning, I think, of just the really eye-opening experiences for me in terms of, I remember telling someone about that experience and how upset that I was, and they didn't understand why I was upset. Like, they thought it was okay that people were using that language, and admittedly that is part of the language that was used in the past, but in my mind we've progressed, and how come we didn't know that we had progressed? In my first 2 years in Maine, it was really hard. I became pretty angry, like a very angry person. I was kind of an angry black woman for a real long time, because every place I went, especially in York County, I felt like people were looking at me, and they actually were. Sometimes they were kind of looked. My partner was in the back there with the little girl in white. So like, we're not two black people at that time, it was just us and my son, so we were like the family of color. So that really stood out for people. And there would just be days where I honestly couldn't leave my house because I was pretty angry. And I hadn't really learned how to manage feeling like a zoo attraction, which honestly has been my experience, and another part of just kind of eventually learning to write and channel my feelings into something constructive. But one of the things that has been interesting, in the first 2 years of living in Maine, was that it gave me a deep appreciation for growing up in a diverse space and recognizing how limiting it can be when people don't live in diverse spaces, because you don't know what you miss. The 2-year mark in Maine was a pretty big, significant piece for me. My mom, a year after we moved to Maine, was diagnosed with cancer. But before her diagnosis, she came to Maine to visit me. And she thought it was the most interesting place she had ever seen. She called it Pleasantville, if you remember that movie. She's like, everything here is so pleasant. The people are just like Pleasantville. And my mom was a really personable human being, so she could turn a bad situation into a joke. So, when she came to visit, she was just sort of like, you just have to smile at these people. And it made nice instead of wanting to punch them in the face. It was interesting because almost 2 years to the day that we were in Maine, my mom died. So I decided that, and I get a little choked up whenever I talk about it, because it really was a turning point. that to honor her memory, I was going to learn to tolerate living in Maine and the people. I won't lie, it's still hard. And there were times, like in years 3 on, that it was really sort of like, why am I still here? But my son was still young and I still needed to be there. It was around year 3 that we actually decided to become homeowners in Maine. And that was real fun. Buying a home in a place where there aren't very many people who look like you. I wouldn't say that the experience was like some of the things that we were aware of in terms of discrimination, but it was a real interesting experience for me in terms of how people, just kind of the process and how racism can affect us even when we think it doesn't affect us. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. Those were some of my earlier days and kind of thoughts about Maine. How I started writing about race in Maine and how I kind of came to the point that Black Girl in Maine was formed outside of my own experiences and sort of grappling with what it felt like to be an adult living in a space where I wasn't mirrored in any way, even down to, even down to experiences like my first couple of years having to travel to Boston to get my hair done because we didn't have any black hair salons. That sounds really trivial. I mean, hair sounds so, I always bring up hair to people, especially in white spaces. And people, I can see sometimes it looks like, what do you mean, hair? Well, let me tell you, in my town, there are all kinds of hair shops, except none of them can do African American hair. And even in the greater Portland area, there are only 2 shops that can do African American hair. So it's these sorts of things that just start to weigh on you. But it was really, I think, like for many people, when you have kids and you start seeing your kids have experiences, that really became sort of my calling card that like, this race stuff isn't just in my head anymore. It's like something I've got to do something about. My son, when he was about 15, 16, kind of started to grow into his full height. My son is 6'4". When we first moved to Maine, he was a cute little 10-year-old kid, 9-year-old kid, something around there. I visually saw the difference in how my son was treated the closer he looked to being an adult man. And I didn't really like that. I would see people visibly recoil when they would see my son because he's a big brown, tan brown kid. But the turning point for us was when he was 16, I was out one evening at a meeting, and I think I've mentioned this publicly in many spaces. I was out at a meeting, and my son was home with my husband, and he went out to go get a sandwich. Maine, New Hampshire, we have all these little convenience type stores that sell sandwiches. Well, my son's journey to go get a sandwich became an experience because in our neighborhood, there had been a series of car break-ins, some kids breaking into cars. The suspects, by the way, were short and white. You need to remember that point. My son came out of the snack shop and he had an iced tea and a sandwich, and the cop thought he looked suspicious and stopped him. My son ended up being brought home in the back of the cop car. As he told me, he knew at that point not to say anything, don't antagonize this officer, because to say anything could make the difference between you ending up dead or alive. His grandmother's an attorney, so he knew how to stay cool. And he said, I'm underage, you need to take me home to my parents. The officer, upon pulling into our driveway and seeing our house, and I live in an old Victorian house, and my husband answering the door and seeing a white man, had a sudden change of heart, especially when my husband questioned him and said, did you pick my son up because he was black? And the officer said, no, things have been happening, we just thought he looked suspicious, I'm really, really sorry. And obviously for anyone who's white who's been partnered with someone black, after a while you have to learn certain things, otherwise you're not going to stay partnered to one another when it comes to race relations in America. But that was a real turning point, because I came home and my husband and my son are telling me the story, and mom is ready to go down to the police station, and I'm ready to let people have it. And my son says, but mom, if you do that, that's going to make things worse for us and for me when I'm walking around here. I'm going to be real frank, that pissed me off, because he actually had a point. That would make things worse, because, to speak up would only create a situation where suddenly I've got the cops probably looking at my house. And he was right, but that was a real turning point for me, because from that day on, through the rest of his high school career. He finished high school with his dad in Wisconsin, and he's 23 now. He has had so many visits, as he calls it, run-ins with the police, that it's hilarious. None of them, there have never been any arrests. There was one time when he went from his dad's house back to his college campus. 5 times he got stopped driving from Illinois to Wisconsin. For those who follow my Facebook fan page, I shared last night a little blurb that my son had written about the Anthony Robinson situation in Wisconsin and sort of his feelings about what it means to be a young black man dealing with the cops. For many people, particularly white people, they don't understand the notion that to be white in America is to be given the benefit of the doubt. So when these conversations come up, I often, especially because I live in Maine, I read people's faces. Well, he had to have been doing something. I can't believe that an officer would pick up somebody or stop them for no good reason. Well, in white world, you're absolutely right. Especially if you're at the top of the pyramid as a white man in America. You rarely are ever going to get stopped for anything. However, if you're at the bottom and you happen to be black, yeah, it can be anything. And I will say that my son's experience has pretty much turned Black Girl in Maine, from which I think my opinion had been, it's going to be a mom blog. We're going to, talk about parenting, to we're going to talk about race. Because one of the things that I found is that whenever I would share just with people I knew personally things that would happen with my son, I would see the eyes roll. I would see the sense of, that couldn't be. And I kind of got tired of it. And I needed to have a place where I could vent, where I could safely vent, and hopefully connect with some other people. As I used to joke, I wanted to find the other 16 black people who lived in northern New England. I mean, I can't imagine that there are more of us than that who have the courage or the whatever to actually live in this part of the country. Because it's interesting, whenever I go home to Chicago or I'm not here, people are always amazed. You live in Maine. First off, there are a lot of people who can't find Maine on a map. In my mind, I think that America just sort of like cuts off at Boston, so people don't even see the corner 3 states. They're like, New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine, like where are those places? So, it's no coincidence that they are 3 of the whitest states in America. But I think a lot of that also has to do with they're not necessarily hospitable places, especially if you don't have family roots. One of the things that in my journey living in New England, especially northern New England, I have been pleased to find this rich depth of Black American history that is not really ever mentioned. My undergraduate degree is in African American Studies, though I did a very specific focus on health disparities racially. But so I love African American history, because all through the schooling years that our public dollars pay for, black people are nothing more than a footnote that gets slavery and Dr. King, and now we throw in Obama. And so we have people who are ignorant of the fact of there was this thing called Jim Crow, and how Jim Crow still affects people today, because many of the people who lived under Jim Crow, like my father, they're not all that old, they're in their 60s and 70s. But since nobody decided it was important enough to put into an American history book, at best we get those 28 sad sack days instead of being included into the whole rich tapestry of American history. So it has been amazing for me in Maine to connect with the Talbot Ross family. Had the pleasure, actually, a few months ago, one of the demonstrations, for those of you who don't know Gerald Talbot, I figure that name probably rings a bell for many of you. He's now, I think, in his 80s, and at one of the demonstrations after Ferguson and then after the Eric Garner lack of indictment, we had an actual demonstration in Portland, and Gerald marched. I mean, he's 80-something on a cane, and my husband and daughter kind of had to help him because he couldn't keep up with the rest of the group. And his daughter, Rachel, who's the head of the Portland NAACP, was like, I'm really sorry, but thank you for helping. I said, it is an honor. This man is like a black history icon that probably outside of New England, nobody knows who he is. It is a pleasure to walk with this man who was walking 50 years ago, but it's sad that he still has to walk right now. I think about the fact that we're, talking about Bloody Sunday and that fantastic speech that Obama gave yesterday, and I think it's a shame that nobody really wants to say that for how far we think we've come. We still have a lot further to go in this country when it comes to race. That said, a lot of my work and a lot of what I'm about these days is uncomfortable conversations around race. As I joke, nobody invites me to dinner anymore because I apparently lost all my manners, and I believe in having uncomfortable conversations. And now that I'm a woman in my 40s, well, anybody who's a woman who's ever been in her 40s, you know what starts to happen. So my filters really are off. It's like, woo, heat surge, let's have a reality check. Because that's what it means to grow older, to pull this mask off, to pull these layers, and to really be honest. And talking about race in this country is one of the hardest things, especially in an interracial setting. It's not comfortable. And a lot of that has to do with, and again, this is where my time in Maine and having a white partner has been really beneficial. White American culture is really polite. I actually think white culture in general is fairly polite, unless you break it down by class. But if typically we're talking middle class and above, there's just a list of things you never talk about. And it's been interesting for me to sort of unpack that with white people. Why don't we talk about those things? Because to talk about it seems rude. Yeah, but to not talk about it, it's also rude. And to get people to understand that, one of the things that people talk about now, well, if we keep talking about racism, we're creating racism. How are we creating racism? By talking about racism. If we're never going to move beyond these conversations and these incidents unless we really start to have real dialogue around race in this country, and the fact that there's parallel experiences. And again, it's my experience as a black woman living in Maine, surrounded by white people, yet having grown up in black spaces and mixed race spaces, and really being able to see that difference. That I used to get really mad when white people wouldn't understand what I was saying. Why can't you hear me? Is there a fit? What you really? And then I realized, no, you really can't understand me. Because your world experiences don't line up with mine in any way. And again, it goes back to that, in your world, you're given the benefit of the doubt. You are allowed to be human. You are allowed to make mistakes. Well, in America, there's a racial hierarchy. The closer your proximity to whiteness, even if you aren't white, you still get some white benefits. The further away you get from whiteness, if you can actually, it's an actual term, I didn't make that up if you wanted to Google it. The darker you get, the less white-like you appear, the less privilege you get. Well, I'm not white, so I get no privilege. Though it's interesting being partnered to a white person. I get a little bit of that runoff privilege. But I don't get to play the race card with my white Amex card now. But it's interesting to have these conversations, to get white people to really see. Part of why we don't understand each other when we talk about race is because our experiences are different. We aren't given that same benefit of the doubt, and that's part of why blogs like mine and conversations that I like to be a part of are so beneficial, I think, to white people. And it's interesting because the blog did not start off, most of my readers are white. It took me a while to figure that out, because I didn't write for white people in mine. I'm black, I wrote to connect with other people of color. But in recent years, as I've started running some of the analytics and looking, I'm like, wow, it's amazing. Actually, white people are reading this, and hopefully maybe they're taking it and they're having conversations around race. Because one of the things that I find is people are often quick to want to engage me around race, but I'm interested in, are you engaging each other around race? When you get together at the Thanksgiving table, in fact, during the holiday seasons, I kind of made jokes with my friends. Everybody's got that cranky uncle man who might have those tea party-related connections. That's the guy you need to have a conversation with. You guys are cutting that turkey. What do you think about Ferguson? What do you think about Mike Brown? Don't talk to me about it. I'm living it. I know it. I understand it. But are you willing to have those conversations and be uncomfortable? I feel like a large part of why we don't do anything, why we don't really progress, is because we're not willing to be uncomfortable. Laws were changed, and definitely, I was listening to the speeches yesterday. Who would have thought that 50 years ago in this country we would have an African American president? That is absolutely, boom. But we cannot deny the fact that at the same time we have an African American president, when we look at what's happening to the black community and the violence that's being perpetuated, like something's not lining up here. It feels a little bit like, hey guys, boom, we gave you the black president. Don't notice the fact that wages are stagnant for everybody, but they're really stagnant for black people. Look at the disparities in the criminal justice system. That the policies that were set in place back in the 80s have created a situation where our prisons are unfairly balanced with black people. That's, you know, we need to be able to look at all of that. And it's hard to have that conversation because we just want to look at that one good thing. But as amazing as President Obama is, and I love his wife, like, we need more. We need more. This is interesting to me that this is one of the first times I've spoken in New England, and I just realized, like, this group is racially mixed. That's really cool. I often go into spaces and, like, everybody's white, so it's like a really interesting thing to me to talk about race when I'm the only person of color in that space. So I'm just sort of acknowledging the rich diversity in this, like, now that I'm looking at you all, and I think that that is important, and it speaks to the need that I think a lot of us have, that we want to do more. That we recognize that something is not right, but we don't know how to have that conversation. And I guess that sort of leads into what I actually do for a living. I know in the introduction, I made note of the fact that I'm the Executive Director of Community Change, Inc. Community Change, Inc. is a really unique organization. We are one of the few organizations of our kind in the United States. And it is a pleasure to be the head of that organization. Our work is anti-racism work, specifically with a focus on working with white people. Community Change, Inc. was born out of the race riots of 1967 in Detroit. For those who were around then, I'm going to be honest, I wasn't around then, so I just had to rely on the history books and what our 91-year-old founder has told me. Those race riots at that time were some of the worst riots this country had ever seen. Obviously, the administration, all the muckety-mucks, oh my God, black people, what are we going to do with these black people? We got to put them in their place. Let's form a commission. That commission became known as the Kerner Commission. That group was interesting. You had a group of white men who were charged with figuring out what's wrong with black people. In the winter of 1968, that commission issued their verdict. And it was, if you've ever read what they wrote, and you look at what's going on right now, it's mind-blowing, the similarities. The commission said and felt that it's not a black problem, it's a white problem. Like the systems that have been created, put in place, and upheld by white people are creating the conditions that have black people not too happy. And when people aren't too happy, they rise up. The commission, a lot of suggestions, thoughts on what could be done. We did a little bit of that in this country, but I don't think we did most of it. And that's why we're back in the same place, hence the summer of 2014, the continuing things that we're seeing. Anyway, Horace Selden, who is now 91 or 92, I get it confused. He's getting up there in age. He was a minister, Methodist minister in Boston area. And he had been doing work in Roxbury and communities of color in the 50s and early 60s, starting to kind of see for himself sort of, wow, black people really aren't getting a fair shake in life. In 1968, he heard the Kerner Commission report combined with the assassination of Dr. King, and as he calls it, it was his Paul moment. For those of you who are familiar with the Bible, the road to Damascus, Paul got knocked off, went blind, and was like, whoa, I'm down with Jesus now. But basically, that's what happened to Horace Selden. He literally was like, I'm starting a group of white people, we're getting together, and we're going to fight racism. And at that time, we didn't have, like, you know, the language we have now, anti-racism and all of that stuff. He literally was just kind of like searching in the dark, trying to figure it out as a white minister. Over the years, our work has sort of evolved. We have many different components of work that we do. We do training and development, which has really always been at the core of what we do, but we did it for many years sort of just with individuals. We have groups that meet weekly that allow, as I call it, safe space for white people to talk about race, because everybody needs a safe space, and I recognize that for white people, when they unpack racism, there's a real danger in like white people then becoming guilty. And my thing is like, white guilt serves no purpose, but you need to understand your place and how you got there and and that you did it on the backs of my people, like, you know, looking at things like redlining and the GI Bill and how, you know, the middle class in America got created, but it also disenfranchised a whole group of people. Even black GIs came back and didn't have access to the same things. So when everybody wants to say, hey, well, my family did that, that's absolutely fantastic that your family did that, but the federal government made it so that most black families couldn't do that. So again, you rode in on the backs of us. And that's okay, because we all stand on somebody's shoulders. We don't have to feel guilt for it because we ourselves are not intentionally oppressing people. But we are intentionally oppressing people if we choose to remain ignorant of these facts and not put it all together and go, what can I do? What is my part? And that's what our work at CCI is about. Over the years, we've worked with folks, the dearly departed Howard Zinn, Noam Chomsky, Peggy McIntosh, who for people who maybe went to college in the late 80s moving forward, she wrote that piece around white privilege, almost helped bring the term white privilege into the mainstream. So we do a lot of kind of cross work with some scholars who work in this area. We have an internship program where we work with college students and some high school students, really sort of unpacking whiteness, unpacking white supremacy, and just a host of other things that we do. And it's a really unique organization to head up. We're located across from the Massachusetts State House right on the Hill. You know, we're a small organization. We have, interestingly enough, we have a private library. It's a lending library. It is the largest library on race in the US that is not housed in an academic setting. It's an impressive sort of thing to behold. I don't have enough hours in my day to read all the books, and it's pretty cool. My time in Maine a couple of years ago, it became real clear that I was not being all that happy living in Maine or working in Maine. And there's always, I kind of tell stories and I ramble, but they all have a point and it kind of ties together at some point. A few years ago, it became really clear that the writing that I was doing and sort of speaking out about race was starting to have kind of an impact on me. Prior to coming to Community Change, I was the executive director of a faith-based center that worked with low-income youth. And it's interesting because my dad's a retired minister and I almost went to seminary myself, so I'm a PK. And it's interesting to me that in faith communities, we don't talk about race. And when you are a PK, like there are just certain things, for those who don't know that term, that's preacher's kid. I'm a preacher's dog. There's things that are ingrained in you. And so I spent 5 years heading up this organization, being surrounded by all these great people of faith. None were non-white. They were all white. And whenever I would talk about things, it'd be like, oh, Shay, we don't see race. Oh, Shay. I have one thing that I hope people, if they ever hear me talk or meet me or read my stuff, don't ever tell a person of color that you don't see race. When you tell a person of color that you don't see race, you've basically invalidated my whole existence as a human being. Because guess what? I come in a package and it ain't white. It's not like yours. And it filters, it's part of me. I don't, like, I'm not just, it's important. So, like, the colorblind thing was something that I struggled with. Around that time that I realized that I probably was not long for that job, I ended up on the Melissa Harris Perry show. And that was a real fluke. That was 2012, after the elections. GOP in Maine made some inflammatory comments that went national, saying that there were no black people in Maine, and we have reports of, like, black people being busted. Most, like, ridiculous thing. So, of course, when it went national, people were sort of like, well, there has got to be black people in Maine. So, like, if you Google, I think, black people in Maine, you get black girl in Maine. So I ended up being, invited on the show via Skype, and it was so funny to me that, like, I didn't even realize people in this part of the country, like, even watched the Melissa Harris Perry show. I told no one except for, like, 3 or 4 friends who weren't from here that I was going to be on the show. By Monday morning, I'm showing up places, and people were like, oh my God, you are the... I'm like, how did you know that? I didn't know you people actually watched that show. I thought you watched the Fox network or something like that. But it started to shift things for me because I had been writing, but the greatest thing about being a writer is that no one ever sees you. So like people had no idea. There have been people who knew me but hadn't like connected the fact that I was the person writing it. They just knew me as the executive director of this faith-based group. So it started to become a little uncomfortable because the nonprofit world, and I'm sure it's the same actually here in New Hampshire, it's really small and everybody knows everybody. It's like 1.5 degrees of separation. As I tell people, you know, I went to graduate school in New Hampshire, and then the foundation that ended up being our largest funder turned out the person who made the funding decisions was part of my cohort in graduate school. So it's like, it's all like, so when people start like reading your thoughts and they're seeing you in meetings, it changes the dynamic. So it became kind of clear to me that I think I'm going to have to move on, or else I'm going to have to stop talking about race if I plan on earning a living here anymore, because, you know, people don't want to fund your stuff if you're saying things that tends to upset them. So it's kind of a weird thing that I applied for this, you know, this job and ended up getting it, and I hadn't even been prepared to move to Boston, which is part of why I still commute. But I will say that it's been an interesting 14 months. I've been ED now for 14 months, making this like extreme commute from Saco, Maine to Boston, which is 2 hours and 20 minutes. That's if the train runs right. The train doesn't really run right. If you've ever taken that Downeaster train, it's sort of like, we'll get you there when we want to get you there. But in many ways, and my most recent blog post is about this, because people always ask me, like, oh my God, how do you deal with this commute? I felt like my soul got free. One of the things people ask me about deeply, and I guess I'll get into, is what is the toll of being that is taken when you are the only person like you in spaces? And I would have never known the answer to that 13 years ago. I mean, I would have thought I knew, like, oh, I knew what it's like to go to school and there are only like 4 black kids in the class. I mean, I remember that in 4th grade. But this is different, when it's like you could go through your whole day as an adult, you can go to work, go to meetings, and no one looks like you. It started to take a toll. I suffer from anxiety, I practice yoga. Even yoga was a challenge for me, because go to the yoga studio and there's nobody who looks like me. You know, and I had to kind of get over some barriers in my mind just to even get into practicing yoga. But I didn't realize the toll that it took on me being in a white space until I took my job in Boston. And let me just say that as a Chicagoan, Boston to me is a really small little city. I'm like, it's a cute little city. You can pick it up, put it in Chicago, run laps around it. You know, it's small. I mean, I know it's the biggest city in New England, and whenever I say that to Bostonians, they get all like, and I have to remind them, I'm not from Maine. I live in Maine, but I'm from Chicago. Oh, that's right. You're from a really big city. Like, yeah, so don't get it twisted. You guys hear I'm from Maine, and everybody thinks you're like a bumpkin. I've learned in my first couple months working down here. Be like, oh, you live in Maine, and they kind of look at you like okay. People have these perceptions of folks in Maine and New Hampshire. But one of the things that has been like life affirming for me is I had 2 executive director positions in Maine. And I would go into meetings, and it was really hard. First off, I got my first executive director position when I was 31. So I'm already, I was already like the youngest person, and even now I continue to still be the youngest ED in rooms. Though I'm at that age now, as I call it, well, the great grace of melanin is there's a certain stage in life that black women get to, you just have no idea how old we are. We could be 35 or 72. Like, you just don't know how old we are. But I'm often aware that I'm always the youngest person in spaces. And one of the things that, like, several months ago, a group of black women who are executive directors in Boston reached out to me to say, you need support. We're gonna, like, this is your, like, list of people to call. You're like learning to navigate Boston. And it was the most amazing thing, because all my years of being an executive director in Maine, like, I didn't have support. I would have 1 or 2 white male mentors, but no actual, like, person like me, and always sort of having to be aware that some spaces was awkward because there weren't a lot of women executive directors, because oddly enough, the nonprofit world, and that's another whole bag there, a lot of women, a lot of minorities who actually do the work, but then you look, especially if it's an organization that's got a reasonable size budget of a few million or more, your EDs or CEOs are always like white men. So Having to learn to navigate those spaces without support is really, really hard, and I didn't realize it until I was in Boston. Now I've got like women I can call and say, hey, I need some support, man. I'm dealing with funders, and and I can get that support. And for me, realizing like literally, I get on the train, get off in Boston, and feel like this, like I took a load off. And then I get on the train and I go home and I feel like, oh, people go, oh, aren't you excited to be home this weekend? And I started realizing, no, actually, I'm not really excited to be home. I'm happy to see my family. I guess I'm happy to see my old house, which forever needs work. But no, I'm really not very happy because I know that I'm not going to be comfortable in that space. And it's funny because I've had black friends in Maine who have moved. In fact, I joke, most of my black friends in Maine have moved. I've now been there long enough where I'm like, there's cycles. It feels like somebody moved, comes in, you're great friends. People hit that 10-year mark, I'm learning, depending on where they are, they tend to leave. They tend to leave also if they have, I've learned, if they have children who are boys. A good friend of mine lived in Kennebunk for a number of years. Her boys hit that 12. Suddenly they weren't cute either, kind of like my son. She had to go because it became, she went from being like, as I call it, you were the special black lady they all liked, and to all of a sudden you were that threatening, angry black woman speaking up for your kids. So, she had to move. And that makes it hard because it's sort of like you don't ever get a chance to make deep connections. One of the things that's hard for me is raising a child. I have a little girl back there, she's 9, and because most of my family has died while I've lived in New England, and we don't see black people regularly, she doesn't have that same sense of family that I grew up with, and I'm finding the older I get, that is so important. I grew up, again, there are relatives who now that I'm old, I didn't even realize they weren't really related to us. And I think that's part of the family ties that are often made in African American communities where we have aunt so-and-so, uncle so-and-so, cousin whoever, and you realize you'll be 50 years old and realize that person was no blood relation to you. But it's okay because you're family. And I definitely miss that and having that for my daughter. My son, because of the age difference, has some pieces of that. And I do see where it can be problematic to not have that, especially as I've met young people. One of the interesting things in writing this blog over the years, especially in the past couple of years, as it's gotten more attention, is meeting younger people of color who read the blog, who will tell me wow, you just gave voice to something that I didn't think, I thought it was just in my head. A young woman who I'm getting to know, was raised up in Gray, Maine, and she was adopted. And she was the only black person she knew until she was 20-something years old. And I just think oh my gosh, we had dinner recently and it became sort of this, me sort of unpacking all the stuff and her just going, I needed this. And her white friends going, she really needed to have an older black woman have this conversation with her. Because when you live in spaces that are all white, you don't really think about what does that mean to your development, how you see yourself. And I think of that a lot, raising my daughter. What does it mean to not see yourself mirrored in another person? Growing up in Chicago, and I went to public schools, but I had black teachers. And it's interesting to me that, at my age now, I still remember every black teacher I had in elementary school and in high school. And one of the things that I'm fascinated by is the fact that, in our town and the town next to us, there are no non-white teachers. And people will tell me, Shay, I know what you're saying, but we're getting more diverse. Yeah, now you've got 7 black kids in the school, and that's great. It makes you feel that there's diversity. But what does it do for those kids? And that's where I do think, and it's an uncomfortable thing to say, and I'm pretty open and honest, that I think that kind of takes a toll on you in terms of your identity. I mean, if you move here as I did as an adult, it's still hard, but I think if you raise kids here, how do they know their place? Young lady that I just mentioned, she told me a story that that part of I'm tearing up because her mom didn't know how to do her hair. It goes back to that hair thing. So she took her to the local hair place, and she had long hair, Afro textured hair, so it was a little kinky, but that's okay. If you know how to handle it, you know what to put in it. and the hairdresser cut off all her hair. Like, cut it all off because it wasn't manageable. I was just blown away. Like, your mom allowed that to happen? Yeah. You're a little kid. You want to fit in. The last thing you want to do is, you're already the only black kid. You don't want to be the little black girl who only has 1 inch of hair on your head because nobody knew how to do your hair. You know, and that's one of the things that I do see that happens a lot. I know my blog, we have a number of readers who adopt transracially. I am actually honored when people reach out and ask me questions about things. I mean, there was a period of time I was sort of like, do I look like a hair person to you? I'm not a beautician. But, I realized that part of my responsibility in the global village of being a black woman is to do whatever I can to support people of color. And I feel really strongly about that, and it's one of the reasons that when people typically, for those who follow me on Twitter, I admit I can be kind of a grumpy curmudgeon. That sometimes I really do feel like, stop asking me stuff. But there are certain things that I feel are just our responsibility because that's how, in the African American community, we have come up, and that most certainly has been part of how I was raised. So you give back. You get to stand on somebody's shoulders and you get to give back. So I don't mind doing that. I don't mind being in spaces where I have these talks and, hopefully hope that someone gets something out of this. I just realized I don't have a watch on. I've just sort of had a rambling talk about my experiences. Not sure if we're at the Q&A portion yet. Oh, yeah, I think we might almost be there. But I think that's sort of kind of like where I'm at. Those are my experiences of talking about living here and just everything. So I think at this point we can move to the Q&A portion. Oh.